This pipeline is in the ground, so it technically should be ours.
Tonight, a plan is taking shape for First Nations to take ownership of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and oversee its expansion.
And to suggest for a moment that she was incompetent is absolutely ridiculous.
Grand Chief Stewart Phillip weighs in with his take on Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould being shuffled out of a high-profile portfolio.
Where I came from, everyone spoke Cree and looked Cree, and then when I came here, everybody was like white and spoke English or French.
And a Cree adoptee scooped from her grandparents reflects on the payout that is coming to some of the survivors. Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. A group of Indigenous leaders says the holdup of the Trans Mountain Pipeline by federal environmental legislation is costing them money. So the Indian Resource Council is meeting in the heart of Canadian oil country to figure out how they can buy the pipeline and get more oil moving to the west coast. Tamara Pimentel has the story.
While some are calling for a stop to pipeline construction in BC, members of the Indian Resource Council are meeting in Tsuut'ina Nation near Calgary. They're discussing a plan that can make them owners of the controversial Trans Mountain Pipeline.
It's an opportunity to find ways that some of our communities can get out of poverty.
The IRC represents over 130 First Nations across Canada with oil and gas interests. Stephen Buffalo is the CEO.
It's the Indigenous communities that have an opportunity to. We represent the oil and gas producing nations here in Canada, and right now without world market access, the price differential on the product is hurting.
Last summer, the federal government bought the pipeline for $4.5 billion, but says it does not want to be a long-term owner. The expansion would triple the amount of diluted bitumen that is shipped from Edmonton to a terminal in Burnaby, BC. Along the route, some Indigenous communities signed an agreement for the project, while others are protesting against it. The project is now delayed after the Federal Court of Appeal ruled there needs to be more consultation with Indigenous people. Now the IRC says most of its members want to buy the pipeline and make it 100% Indigenous owned and operated, bringing in more jobs and economic opportunity.
But saying that, we got to start consulting with each other. Obviously, we definitely honor and respect the three tribes on the coast with their position as they brought to attention Kinder Morgan and the federal government. But now that's hurting our communities here.
Communities like the Kainai Nation, south of Calgary. Kainai has been involved in the oil and gas industry for 7 decades. Chief Roy Fox is also an IRC board member. He says the lack of pipeline capacity and Bill C-69, which imposes new environmental assessment measures on Canada's resource sector, will cost every family on his reserve nearly $1,400 per year.
If Bill C-69 and C-48 goes through, I don't think you'll see any new pipelines. Or if these two bills go through in their existing form, they're deal killers.
If you talk to any Indigenous leaders, they want to see economic development. And I think this is one area that, we can definitely take advantage of. You talk to our treaty chiefs. You've heard our national chiefs say the depth of a plow. And, people need to understand what that means. And so this pipeline is in the ground, so it technically should be ours.
When the forum is over, the best plan will be selected and presented to Ottawa in the coming months. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Calgary.
The 60 Scoop class action settlement is currently gathering survivors for a large payout. Canada will pay out as much as $50,000 to each survivor. But for many, signing up involves confronting childhood trauma. Tom Fenario has that story.
I meant to fix this shoebox.
This is a picture of 6-year-old Trina Rose Slapkoff at summer camp. For most, a childhood photo like this would invoke waves of nostalgia. But 43 years after this picture was taken, Slapkoff is still working on processing her childhood.
When I was adopted, I remember being very angry as a child I guess everybody, like, where I came from, everyone spoke Cree and looked Cree. And then when I came here, everybody was like white and spoke English or French.
In the early 70s, Slapkoff was scooped from her family in The Pod, Manitoba, when she was only a year and a half old. She says her birth father came back from a hunting trip to find out that she had been taken from her grandparents.
My native dad said that he used to say my name to give me strength. And because he knew that it was probably really hard for me when he didn't know where I was.
Although Slapkoff now has a good relationship with her biological father, she says growing up nearly 3,000 kilometers away in Montreal left her feeling isolated. She describes the feeling as being a stranger in your own skin.
There was nobody there, to help me.
Slapkoff is one of an estimated 20,000 Indigenous people scooped as children. Many of them are signing up for a class action settlement. Melanie Vincent is in charge of a series of cross-country info sessions on behalf of Collectiva, the law firm taking care of the settlement. At this recent session in Montreal, the Huron-Wendat woman emphasizes that it's free to apply.
What is very important is to, in case of any doubt, if you don't have all the documents, if you're not sure about your eligibility, if you're not sure about the Indian status eligibility, you can file a claim. And even though it's not a complete form, Collectiva is there to help you out and find those information.
Teely Normanton is also a 60 Scoop survivor. She says on this day she's attending mainly in her role as an outreach worker. Although she describes the application process as simple, the Mohawk woman says she has clients that are eligible but in danger of falling through the cracks before the August 30th deadline.
Dealing with an application, dealing with an information session, it seems to be overwhelming. So coming here today, I want to make sure I get the information so I'm clear and precise so I can go and visit them at home, bring them the applications, talk to them, and most importantly, be the support that they need.
Slapkoff intends to apply even though she feels the estimated $25,000 to $50,000 she could receive is insufficient.
Class action suit is not giving enough money for people who have suffered this much, Because when I was a little kid, I remember I wanted to kill myself.
Slapkoff says she no longer feels that way and has taken steps to surround herself with a support system. But while she has a degree in community economic development, she is currently unemployed. She says a large portion of whatever money she might get will go to pay debt. But more than anything, she's hoping the settlement will help her healing journey to a day when going through her shoebox of photos is less fraught with emotional turmoil. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Montreal.
The chief of Eskasoni First Nation is calling on all levels of government to step up and provide more funding for mental health and addiction services in his community. Chief Leroy Denny held a press conference to speak out after a rash of suicides in recent weeks in the largest Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. Sources tell APTN News that 4 people have died by suicide recently. Many in the community of about 4,500 people are grieving the loss of loved ones. Denny says current funding is inadequate to address Eskasoni's needs, including the trauma experienced by residential survivors and their families.
Right now the support is there. Our people are coming together. We have a few comfort centers within the community. And for the community, last night there were over 100 people in this small Access U building, the other end, the reserve, and we have the crisis line. And we added more workers to help and assist our frontline workers. Been talking with
Denny wouldn't say how many deaths there have been in recent weeks, but says even one death is too many. The trial of 2 men accused of manslaughter in connection with the shooting death of a Winnipeg woman has wrapped up after more than a week of testimony. As Brittany Hobson reports, what happens next is in the hands of a jury.
It was a botched robbery that resulted in the death of Janine Fontaine, Crown prosecutors argued over the course of 6 days of testimony. Jason Mayer and Christopher Brass are facing manslaughter charges in connection to her death. The 29-year-old was found in a North End home on March 14, 2017. She was shot in the back of the head and her house was set on fire. The jury previously heard Mayer and Brass went to Fontaine's home with a third man, Malcolm Mitchell, to collect a drug debt from Fontaine's boyfriend, who wasn't in the house at the time. The Crown says that's when the men decided to rob Fontaine. Mitchell has already pleaded guilty to shooting Fontaine.
We know who the killer is. We now know Malcolm Mitchell killed Janine Fontaine, said Crown Prosecutor Michael Desautel. But he says Mayer and Brass are equally responsible in the killing of Janine Fontaine. We're going to ask you to convict Brass and Mayer of manslaughter because during that robbery, it was entirely foreseeable that someone would be hurt. Mayer's lawyer argued there's no proof a robbery occurred because valuables were left untouched. The prosecution's reliance on this being a robbery gone wrong does not make sense. They would have taken the obvious items of value if they were planning a robbery, said Theodore Mariash. Brass's lawyer, Tara Walker, said the Crown has not proven her client was even present at the home when the shooting occurred. We know he was not the person who shot Miss Fontaine, as is an agreed fact, Malcolm Mitchell was the shooter. Walker argued even if Brass was at the house, the Crown hasn't made a case he knew what was going to happen. Merely standing by, doing nothing, is not evidence they helped the person commit an offense. Fontaine is a cousin of Tina Fontaine, whose own death propelled the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
The judge is set to give his instructions Friday morning, at which point the jury will begin deliberations. Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Family, friends, and those upset with the actions of Winnipeg police gathered on Wednesday night to honor Chad Williams. Williams was shot and killed by police last week. A few dozen showed up at the spot where he was shot and killed. There are reports Williams was involved in a previous confrontation with police in 2016. Some of the vigils say that should have been seen as a cry for help. They called for more support for those with mental health and addictions issues and for more cultural awareness for Winnipeg police.
We want to honor Chad this evening, and we want to bring awareness to the excessive force that the police do use and the way they treat our people. Enough is enough.
This week's federal cabinet shuffle isn't sitting well with some. Details on that and much more after the break. Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. -1 for Halifax, snow, and -4 for Fredericton. -24 in Nain, 28 below for Kuujjuaq. -8 in snow in Montreal, -9 with snow for Quebec City, -1 in London, Peterborough, and Sarnia, -11 in North Bay, -23 for Thunder Bay and Wawa, -27 in Sioux Lookout, -32 for Churchill, 1 degree warmer for Puckatawagan, -27 in Winnipeg, 26 below for Princess Harbor and Barons River, -18 in Regina, -21 for Yorkton and Estevan, -21 as well for Meadow Lake and Buffalo Narrows. Welcome back. Prime Minister Trudeau is meeting with his cabinet ministers in Sherbrooke, Quebec. Over the next few days, they will be discussing policy issues they will tackle in the next parliamentary session. Tom Fenario is there to explain.
While the cabinet retreat heads into its second day, it would appear that the recent arrests of anti-pipeline wet'suwet'en protesters has soured many Indigenous people here in Quebec on Justin Trudeau.
Les emprisonnements qui ont eu nos frères et sœurs de l'Ouest, dans l'Ouest, ça a comme touché tous les peuples autochtones du Canada. Trudeau, c'est un traître, première des choses. Il a toujours trahi le peuple autochtone. Il a manipulé le peuple autochtone et les chefs des conseils de bande.
Earlier this week, many Indigenous people were upset to see Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould move from her position as Minister of Justice to a lower-profile role as Minister of Veteran Affairs. New Justice Minister David Lametti wants to assure Indigenous people that he has their interests at heart.
I have a long history as a teacher, teaching not only intellectual property but property law at McGill University, in which I was very sensitive to First Nations issues in my teaching. I'm going to, I think, move in the same spirit as Minister Wilson-Raybould, who did fantastic work in that regard. I shared those very same principles and values as regards to Indigenous peoples, and plan to continue in that light.
The cabinet retreat ends Friday afternoon, during which we will hear from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Sherbrooke, Quebec.
We always welcome your comments. Here's how to continue the conversation. Send your emails to news@aptn.ca. Find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptn news. You can also follow APTN News on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest Indigenous headlines. Well, as you heard, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau shuffled his cabinet this week. Out was Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was moved to Veteran Affairs. Political spectators viewed it as a demotion, which both Wilson-Raybould and Trudeau denied. But many who have worked with her before she was in government suspect it was punishment for the first ever female Indigenous Justice Minister for not dancing to the tune of her non-Indigenous colleagues. Earlier today, we spoke with the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs Grand Chief Stewart Phillip, who worked with her when she was Regional Chief. Grand Chief, appreciate you taking some time for us. There's some talk on the Hill in Ottawa that Minister Wilson-Raybould was demoted for being difficult to work with. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's ridiculous. We've known Jody Wilson-Raybould in British Columbia for many, many years. We've had the privilege and the honor to work alongside her. We know her to be a woman of tremendous integrity, very conscientious, an absolute workhorse. Quite often she would work through the night in preparation for the assemblies and the gatherings we had here in British Columbia. Her work was absolutely meticulous. Her reports were absolutely amazing. She set such a high standard of accountability and transparency in regard to all of the First Nations leaders and communities here in British Columbia. And to suggest for a moment that she was incompetent is absolutely ridiculous. In our view, and as a consequence of our observations, I think she was indeed one of the bright lights at the cabinet table.
Grand Chief, given all that, do you have a theory as to why she was demoted?
Well, I think that sometimes our greatest strengths are, cause for these types of things to happen. I think her light shone so brightly, perhaps Prime Minister felt threatened. It certainly flies in the face of all his empty, lofty rhetoric on reconciliation. I can tell you with great certainty this disappointing and disturbing decision on the part of the Prime Minister has reverberated across this country, and our members in our communities, all of our members held Jody Wilson-Raybould in such high regard. We were so proud of her, and there's enormous disappointment. I don't think you're going to find too many people supporting the Liberals during the next federal election.
Grand Chief, we'll hold it there, but really do appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us here.
Thank you.
A new episode of APTN Investigates debuts right here tomorrow night. We'll bring you a sneak peek after the break, but first here's a preview of what's in store for you after the news tonight.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and here's what's coming up on Nation to Nation. We have the first full interview Seamus O'Regan has given a national network. Prime Minister named him the new Indigenous Services Minister on Monday. As well, NDP MP Charlie Angus gives his thoughts on O'Regan's appointment. And on the move of Jody Wilson-Raybould from Justice to Veterans Affairs. We also have an inkling of what the Conservatives' Indigenous platform looks like heading into the next federal election. A hint, the phrase resource development comes up. That's all following the national news.
Here's the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. -20 for Fort McMurray, -15 in Peace River, -1 with snow in Lethbridge, -6 with snow in Medicine Hat, +9 with showers for Vancouver, Tofino, and Campbell River, -21 in Fort Nelson, -4 in Smithers, 7 above in Prince Rupert. In the Yukon, -24 in Old Crow, -20 in Watson Lake. In the NWT, -30 under sunny skies in Yellowknife, 16 below in Norman Wells, -24 for Colville Lake and Tuck, -20 in Paulatuck, -36 in Chesterfield, 39 below for Whale Cove, -38 in Baker Lake, -30 in Arctic Bay. Welcome back. The history of the Dakota people is not widely known in Canada. They were considered refugees from the U.S. and didn't sign treaties. Now a determined group from southwestern Manitoba is fighting for their rights. Here's a preview of APTN Investigate reporter Chris Reed's Refugees Were Righteous.
I'm proud of it, being proud of what our ancestors did.
I can only speak for Dakota Plains and its people. We've always recognized the fact that we were here at time immemorial. There is no Manitoba border. There is no international border.
Chief and I, sometimes we wonder, like, why are we here? Why us, right? But we've always had that inquisitive nature that it's like disobedience.
It was something I grew up with my mother, and then because my mother got it from her grandmother, my grandmother was kind of like knew the relations, the oral histories, and my mother was raised by her grandmother, and then she carried it on to her children, which is us, and then so picking it up from my mother, from my grandmother, and then my great-grandmother, it was always in our family to be knowing our history, knowing who we are.
And you can watch that entire show tomorrow night right after the APTN National News. And that is your APTN National News for this Thursday. You can find more on our website, aptnnews.ca. And follow our social media pages. We'll be bringing you updates on Friday from our team in Washington, D.C., who are down there for the Indigenous Peoples March. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.